Hello, I'm Anna Kalczynska and this is World Talks, where every word matters. Germany set to hold early elections February next year following Chancellor Olaf Scholz's governing coalition collapse. His government fell after months of wrangling between the two parties and the coalition partner neoliberal Free Democrats, who demanded cut spending on a scale their left-wing partners were unwilling to countenance. And joining me now is Benjamin Tallis, Director of Democratic Strategy Initiative. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. A pleasure to be with you.
So let me start with a quote. "It's important that we get new elections as soon as possible," said Carsten Linnemann, General Secretary of the Christian Democrats. Friedrich Merz, Germany's opposition leader, is gunning for Olaf Scholz's position as Germany Chancellor. Does he have any chance to get it?
Yes, I think there's every chance that Friedrich Merz will be the next Chancellor of Germany. Of course, we have to wait till the election results, and anything could happen. But the most likely outcome is that the party that Merz leads, the Christian Democrats, the CDU, centre-right conservative current opposition party, will be the largest party in that election. And it's the largest party that gets to choose the Chancellor. The big question is, who will Merz govern with? Who will be the coalition partners or partners for the CDU? Will it be the Social Democrats in a so-called grand coalition? Will it be the Greens? And will we see the Free Democrats, who you mentioned, even make it into the parliament? The last question there is what percentage, what share of the vote the AfD, the far-right party, or the red-brown Sarah Wagenknecht party will get? And they could be spoilers for coalition formation.
We'll get back to it soon, but let me go back to the reason why the coalition actually broke up. The reasons in general are well known, but what was the immediate trigger?
Well, yes, as you say, the preconditions for this have been in place for a long time. It was a zombie government, and frankly, it's a relief that it's going to be going sooner than expected, and I'm sure most of Germany's partners would agree with that as well. But the particular trigger in this case was a disagreement about the budget. It had been well broadcast in advance that in November, the FDP, the Liberals, would be discussing whether they would support the budget, whether they could get enough concessions from Olaf Scholz to have a budget they could agree to. They could not, and so they then made demands that Scholz considered unreasonable, and he actually took the step of dismissing Finance Minister Christian Lindner, who was the leader of the Free Democrats, from the coalition. Shortly afterwards, the ministers of his party, the Free Democrats, stepped down from government and the coalition was over. On that day, it was agreed between the Greens and the SPD, Social Democrats, that it would continue as a minority government. But what we've seen today is actually a bringing forward of the planned election date. So thankfully, we're going to get an election sooner rather than later.
Perhaps what we are losing from a broader perspective is the constitution, the German constitution itself. Olaf Scholz, who runs a minority government with the backing of the Greens, hopes to secure enough opposition support to pass laws to protect the constitutional court from the far right. What if Merz becomes chancellor? What will his approach to Germany's constitutional debt brake be?
That's the $500 billion question, really. We've seen the CDU and Merz himself say that they want to stick with the debt brake. But the suspicion is that because of the situation that Germany finds itself in, because of the situation Europe finds itself in, with the need to invest a lot more in defense, at the same time as Germany needs to reboot its economy, invest in infrastructure, and ensure that people have sufficient social welfare, there's not the money to do that within just the limits of the current spending straitjacket that previous governments have agreed to, this so-called debt brake. So I think there's every chance that we could see a bit of flexibility there. We won't see a complete disintegration of the debt brake, but I can imagine that there would be room for some flexibility.
All right, so let's talk about the financial aid and the military support for Ukraine. Who on the political landscape in Germany is more likely to spend on Ukraine?
Well, it's an interesting question because Friedrich Merz has said many different things about this over the last couple of years. More recently, he's been making some more positive noises towards Ukraine, saying that Ukraine should win its war against Russia, saying that if Russia refused an ultimatum to stop fighting in Ukraine, then Merz would send the long-awaited Taurus missiles that would make a big difference to Ukraine's ability to strike deep into Russia, and that would be with no targeting restrictions. So Merz has been saying that, plus also saying that Ukraine should be in NATO, as have several of the senior figures in the CDU, who may well be ministers in the next coalition. People like Roderick Kiesewetter, Johann Wadefull, Norbert Röttgen, and others have been very clear on this. In terms of money, I think we could expect to see more, particularly if the CDU was in coalition with the Greens, who have been very forward-leaning on Ukraine, who very much understand the need to win the war there and to defeat Russia in order to deter it from future aggression. With the SPD, it would be interesting to see if they would take a more forward-leaning attitude and be willing to give more to Ukraine if the FDP weren't holding them back. But we'll really have to see what the composition of that coalition is.
Exactly. It's difficult to predict whatsoever nowadays, and it's difficult to tell actually anything. But as Politico says, Ostpolitik is now a lost politic. Do you agree on that?
That's a line I coined about a year and a half ago, so I'm happy to hear they've been listening to me, and I hope it was one of my friends who said that.
You're being quoted.
Yeah, it's one. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and indeed, I mean, to be honest, the so-called Ostpolitik we've had for the last 30 years in Germany, the Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade, doesn't deserve the name Ostpolitik. Ostpolitik during the Cold War was something different. It was something from a position of strength where Germany was spending a lot on its military. It was something where there were two different economic systems and there was a genuine possibility to drive change. In the last 30 years, it's really been a fairly miserable excuse for a foreign policy that was basically founded on greed and naivety at best, let's say. So I don't think it really deserves the name. I think it was already lost politik quite a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. So coming back to what can possibly happen in the upcoming weeks, what are the perspectives of cooperation between the Greens and other parties in your mind, in your view?
I think on some issues there are some natural affinities on foreign and defence policy between the Greens and the CDU, and on some of the domestic issues between the CDU and the SPD. But of course, everyone's now in campaigning mode, and so they are also trying to show the differences between them and their rivals. They're trying to show why they are better, and sometimes that involves saying why the others are worse. So that campaign mode mitigates against the notion of forming deals. But I think there is a realization that the adults really have to control the room, and that in case some of the anti-democratic parties were to do better than expected, there's a need to safeguard Germany against that beforehand. But all of this is not taking place in a vacuum, and it's been interesting to see that while Berlin is looking in on itself, Donald Tusk in Poland has been taking the lead, saying we need a strong coalition of willing European states to secure Ukraine. And that's the kind of leadership that Europe needs, but Germany has to learn to follow for a little while that's going on. And the last thing it would be interesting to see what they do on would be about common European defence spending, which of course is massively needed. We've seen this reallocation of money from potentially from cohesion funds to defence, but Europe frankly needs more money, and Germany has been a blocker on that. So I wonder if this is a chance for other European countries to really push Berlin and try and push for a deal in the next few weeks on joint debt for defence.
Well, this is exactly what Annalena Baerbock would say, that Germany would spend more money on Ukraine and on arming the Bundeswehr. This is what she expects. However, these are only the words of Green Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. And rest to be seen, right, what is going to happen after a few months. I would like to invite you also to comment after US elections, because Mike Pompeo, who served as CIA director and later as a Secretary of State, argued that Donald Trump would not allow Kremlin a free hand. As he says, President Trump is not going to allow Vladimir Putin to roll through Ukraine. Yet Pompeo was not invited to the constructed administration. So should he be trusted?
Well, I'm not sure it's a question of whether Mike Pompeo should be trusted, but it's more that we don't really know what a Trump administration will do, although there have been some encouraging signs with some of the appointees, some of whom have said some positive things about Ukraine, some of whom have said some rather mixed things about Ukraine and been inconsistent in the same way that Friedrich Merz has. So it's still rather difficult to understand exactly which direction they're going to take. But the key thing for Europeans is we don't have to wait and see. We have it in our power to actually act to secure Ukraine, to defend ourselves. If we step forward and give more weapons to Ukraine, if we offer real security guarantees to Ukraine, if we seize the $300 billion in Russian assets that are there that we could be using to pay for this, there's a whole raft of things we could be doing which would make us better allies to the US. It would help build European NATO. It would allow the US to do more in the Indo-Pacific while still maintaining our alliance. And it would be insurance against a pullout of US commitment from Europe. And that's been understood by that coalition of the willing. And that's really, I think, the focus has to be. We can't afford just to wait and see what Donald Trump will do.
Definitely not. But still, staying in the US, I would like to ask you about the comments after the first appointment speculations. Mike Waltz, for instance, congressman from Florida, Green Beret veteran, as a national security advisor. Would that be a proof of Trump's more hawkish stance on Russia than during the campaign?
Well, again, Waltz is someone who's said several different things on Ukraine. He's talked about Ukraine not getting a blank check. He voted against speeding up the aid package earlier this year. But at other times, he has said extremely hawkish things, and he has a military background. He's a former Green Beret. We'll have to see exactly what kind of policy position he lays out, but certainly the one that would actually seem to serve America's interests best, as well as serving the interests of the democratic world, would be that more Reaganite foreign policy, peace through strength, and actually understanding that deterring authoritarian foes around the world is firmly in American interest, because America benefits from that international order that is favorable for democracies, in which it frankly rules the roost. And so actually helping other democracies to do well is in American interest. So we'll see if that is carried through. The alternative, of course, is that other forces in the administration would come into play, and Europe would be left more to fend for itself. Ukraine might be left to fend for itself. But this is precisely why we actually need to take the action as Europeans to step up.
How about a possible another name like Mark Rubio, Secretary of State? Mr. Rubio opposed the help for Ukraine. So what would you say?
Well, in the past, Marco Rubio has been more forward-leaning on some of the U.S. foreign policy positions. He's been more towards that Reagan Republican type of camp. And if you look at some of the people who've advised him in the past, like Matthew Koenig, who's now at the Atlantic Council, they are very much from that peace through strength, we win, you lose kind of camp. So we'll have to see if Rubio really carries that through, or if he takes a line more similar to the Trump 1 administration. But let's remember also, under the first Trump administration, they ended up being very hawkish on China, far more so than the Obama administration had been. And they oversaw a time when European defense spending did go up slightly. Their critique of European underspend on defense was correct. Their critique of the Nord Stream pipeline was correct. So it's important that Europeans remember that Trump wasn't wrong about everything, and that we actually certainly had our homework to do. Unfortunately, we haven't really done it for the last 4 years, and now it's really time to step up. And so, as I said before, that means more money for defense. It means getting our act together in the European Union, using the new defense commissioner to push through a more effective approach to defense industry. And that will mean things like reforming the European Investment Bank, Eurobonds, as mentioned, and encouraging a more productive attitude to defense in our financial sector. And I think lastly, it will mean being smart about where we invest. We have a big advantage in Europe with our economy, with our research base. If we start to actually leverage that, rather than trying to run the race that Russia wants us to run, which we will lose, then we could actually think about winning and about defeating Russia and defending ourselves.
All right. Thank you very much, Benjamin Tallis. Thank you for your comments and sharing your analysis with us. Thank you for watching World Talks, but stay tuned for more as we are coming back with comments on commissioners' candidate hearings.